Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Is Professor John Guillebaud, who is, I'm sure, known to many here, and who is really a great expert on the whole field of reproductive technology and population control. He's the Emeritus Professor of Family Planning and Reproductive Health, University College London. We're delighted that he can come to speak to us today on population growth as a prime factor in environmental unsustainability. Thank you very much, John.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it is great to be here today. Before I say much about myself or anything else, I'm going to play a little video which really sets the stage, and hopefully will only run for about 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes. All you need to know is that it is based on a map of the world. Can we just check? We can see a map of the world both overflow and here. And every dot represents 1 million people. It actually starts at birth of Christ, but I started it halfway through. So let's see what happens now if we get started. Gotta do 2 at once. The soundtrack's just a heartbeat. Notice a few dots disappearing, both with China and with what's coming next. But after that, it's a relentless growth. Increased by us physicians when we brought in public health in the 19th century. As we get towards the end, I'd like you to look out for your own date of birth. Not quite yet, but soon. Just see what happened in your own lifetime. Beginning there. Sorry about the delay, folks. I want to get back now to the actual presentation proper. We just need to get it up on this machine. We got it up on next door, I think, now. While it's coming up, No, is that coming off the memory stick?
No, it's on your computer.
Should be. Oh, here we are, coming up. Yeah, sure. Brilliant. Okay, this is just a recap what you just saw. Oop. That is a strange one. I don't know why that's come up. You will, if there's time, you'll get that again. I'll tell you what it was going to say. It says, contraception should be used on every conceivable occasion. Let's try again. Very nearly there now. This should not be doing this. We want that. Right, so we move on to the next little screen, and this one should. Here we are, that's it. Yeah, I think we're getting there. It's getting them in synchrony with each other is the problem. Yeah, hooray. This is what the video finally showed, and you might well think, as you look at that, that we all ought to move to Australia and New Zealand. But if you talk to anybody here from Australia or New Zealand, because over there, if you talk to the scientists there, the environmental scientists, they're perfectly clear that Australia in the middle is all desert, and really 21 million people around the circumference is about right. So how is the starting point here? How could anybody think that this growth of human numbers could be sustainable? Malthus drew attention to the problem that population growth would go up geometrically and outstrip availability of food 200 years ago. There's been a 7-fold increase in numbers since then. And along the way, we thought we'd beaten Malthus, and again, just like we're talking about deniers before coffee about climate change, so the deniers were saying Malthus was wrong, but they forgot that the Green Revolution depends completely on fossil fuels. And it requires them for pesticides, for fertilizers, for transport and for tractors. And now the fossil fuels are on their way out. We're left with a total global population which I believe is now beyond, not just approaching, but beyond sustainability. I was born and brought up in Africa in this beautiful country called Rwanda. That's me on a recent visit, on a crossing. And this is my son and our guide in front of the Genocide and War Museum at Kigali, the capital. And as I looked at this huge concrete slab in front of me, 2 slabs in front of me, and was told by Christine there that this contains the largest mass grave in the world with 250,000 bodies which they've collected together. It was particularly poignant for me that my friend Husi Kajuga and his family and his brother Wilberforce's wife and children and their dad Ustasi, who was a teacher in the school that my father founded there in Rwanda, are all under that slab. And looking at this picture, that's the one who survived. Wilberforce, and he only survived because he was out of the country at a funeral at the time. 90 people on that extended family picture, 2/3 died, and our family knew most of them, or many of them, in the genocide. Now, it is not a coincidence that the population of Rwanda in the 40s, when I was a lad, was about 1.5 million. By the time of the genocide, it had reached 7.5 million. And just don't take my word for it. James Gasana, Rwanda's Minister for Agriculture and Environment in 1992, just leading up to the genocide, he said this: of the 4 lessons to be learned from the genocide in Rwanda, rapid population growth is the major driving force behind the vicious circle of environmental scarcities and rural poverty. In Rwanda, it induced the use of marginal lands and steep hillsides, shortening of fallow, deforestation, soil degradation, resulted in severe shortages of food. And again, it's not just James Kasana, who's well placed to know because he is a Munyarwanda, he lives in that country, or did. But look at the 9/11 Commission report, look at this. High birth rates, declining rates of mortality have produced a common problem throughout the Muslim world. A large, steadily increasing population of young men without any reasonable expectation of suitable, stable unemployment, sure prescription for social turbulence. What's the caption to this picture? The pill is mightier than the sword. And that's the topic of this session. Because over and above all the other aspects of the environment crisis, the bit that comes up is in the background, an increasing risk through this century of more and more violence, both within and between countries. The major growth since 1950 has been, as you see, in the developing world, amazingly little in the developed countries. We'll come back to that point in a moment. If we were to carry on at the same rate, which at the moment we've got 6.7 billion now, and we're rising by approximately 79 million a year, if we were to go on like that for a mere 2,000 or 3,000 years, which is totally impossible, we'd finish up like this, in standing room only. So somewhere between now and then, we have to come to our senses, and I think it should have been before now. Unsustainable. Every 2 minutes, a jumbo jet lands on this planet of ours of humans. And that's not those who are born, that's the excess of those who die. A jumbo jet arriving every 2 minutes, night and day. And of course, we don't just arrive. We need accommodation, we need a building, we need to live. And what I said just now, 79 million a year increment, equates to 1.5 million a week. So that, somewhere in the world, since last Wednesday, a city of 1.5 million people has had to be created. And by next Wednesday, another mega city of 1.5 million people has to be created. Now just stop and think of the footprint of any city. Think of the habitat destruction, 1.5 million people. Think of the energy consumption. Okay, it's probably not a city, it's a huge number of slums. But even slum dwellers use fuel, it's wood, they destroy the surrounding woodland. But they have some access to fossil fuels, and they want to get out of poverty. And anybody who says that population can be carrying on as it is indefinitely has not understood the fact that that means to say we consign 3 billion people to stay in their poverty. 2 billion people, indeed, to live on less than $2 a day. That is, hopefully, totally outrageous and something we would not accept in this room. But that's what it means. This is a recap, of course, of the effect we have on the climate, and the point I'm making here is quite simple. We've had some slogans today, some sound bites, and here's a good sound bite. Climate change, folks, is caused in large measure by the number of climate change-ers. Have you ever heard that said before? Climate change through climate change-ers. We are environment trashers, and we do it because of the number of us environment trashers. And of course, it's the poor who suffer most, for all the reasons we've already discussed before coffee. And we use oil and gas. We talked about climate change, but surprisingly to me, before coffee, no mention of peak oil at all. And yet, if you go to a website, which I commend to, called www.willyoujoinus.com, just willyoujoinus.com, on the homepage, you see the running up of the total of oil at this rate of 1,500 barrels of oil or gas equivalent per second, night or day. And that's driven in part by the number of humans on the planet. Every one of those barrels has got 42 US gallons in it. And that's 1,500 per second, night and day. Who could begin to think that was sustainable? Bananas, the people who run this world. The age of oil. Fascinating facts from before coffee, that the first oil well was exactly 200 years ago. What a tiny age. We were we've been sucking on this, we've been overexploiting this amazing donation, this bounty from millions of years ago, which took thousands of years to produce every lump of coal or every gallon of oil. And in just a blink of 200 years, it's gone. That's a lovely slide, isn't it? Because it really shows peak oil. And folks, we're at peak oil now. No debate. And many people believe that it's going to cause more social turmoil and more problems to you and me sitting now in our suburbia sooner than climate change even. And of course, water is becoming extremely scarce too. There are going to be wars about water very soon in Africa and elsewhere. The point is, our planet is deceptively spacious. This is one of our posters from one of my organizations called the Optimum Population Trust. Let's remind ourselves that this little planet of ours is 3/4 salt water, and half of the remainder is mountain or desert or ice cap. And we're cramming all these human beings into it to their detriment and to the detriment of all the beautiful creatures God made that we share the planet with. Because of our footprints, and I was pleased to hear before coffee about the importance of all of us looking at our own footprints, because it's greedy. It is positively greedy to live the way we do on a hungry planet. There was that great book by Cider, Live Simply so that others can simply live. Here are some websites, if you want them. popconnect.org is where you can get that video. And by the way, I'd love it if everybody who's hearing me now would go to popconnect.org, download or order the Population Dots video onto your laptop, and then bore the pants off everybody you meet by playing it to them, particularly if that person you meet is a politician or a journalist. How could anybody live with such a problem and just think it's not important? When I talk to young people, to kids, I ask them what the most important short equation is in the world, and they come up with E equals mc squared. To my mind, actually, the most important short equation in the world is the IPAT equation. The environmental impact we have has only 3 causes, which multiply with each other. T for technology, I've got to stop the last one. T for technology, how green it is, per person. Affluence / always effluence, can't do one without the other. And consumption, again, per person. And P, the number of persons. How simple could an equation be? So, we want to reduce our impact on this beautiful world. What are we going to do? Technology will help, but almost all scientists are in agreement it will never be able to do it all. Could say lots on that, but I won't. No time. I argue that affluence and consumption ought globally to go up, as the only way out of poverty is by increasing affluence of the very poor. The mirror image of poverty is affluence, surely. Happening in China and India now, and we're screaming about the amount of fossil fuel they're using, but it's their right to do so. And the other reason it's going up, that A factor, is the problem of persuading the already affluent, that's us, to reduce our per person consumption. Let's be honest, and this was hinted at before coffee, most of the actions by governments and individuals so far are token gestures. Do you agree? What really needs to be done, seeing the target of not going above 450 parts per million CO2, just that, leave alone all the other things, they're just gestures. So we have to bite the bullet that A goes up. And T is hugely important, but won't be enough. There are only 3 factors, folks. And yet, a lifetime of being in this business convinces me that population remains the elephant in the room that no one is prepared to talk about. It's a taboo subject. By the way, to take up our chairman a little bit just now, he said I dealt in the issue of population control. You'll find in this lecture, except now, I will never use the word control, and it will not appear in the chapter at all. You will search for it on your, in any way you can, it will not be there. Because the problem is, when you talk about family planning and population, everybody thinks you want to control people. So let's not use the word. Let's talk about meeting needs and choices. As Tearfund said at the time of the Cairo conference, let's not count people, let's make people count, especially women count. And when you do that, as a matter of fact, family sizes do reduce. But we'll come back to that point. So basically we've got, oh gosh, we keep going to spike. I have no understanding of why I was talking earlier about Murphy's Law to a colleague who I'm trying to get set up. And it is unbelievable. Murphy's Law is working today. There are two factors. People feel they can't talk about population. Yet there's a large unmet need for smaller family size. It is amenable to change. It is a myth that the people of the third world don't want it. I know, I go there all the time, to Rwanda, to South Africa, to other parts of Africa, and women, if you talk to them, do not want the size of family they're being forced to have. On the other hand, consumption, people can talk about it, but there's actually no unmet need. Who feels a terrific unmet need here to not use their car so much, to do all the things we have to do? It's not an unmet need. We're dragged kicking and screaming to it, aren't we? But you can talk about it. High time, population stops being seen as a given. Most authorities that I hear speak, if they mention population at all, they mention it as something that is happening. We've got to just face it, we've got to predict and provide for the human numbers. They haven't been reading the literature, they haven't been talking to people like myself over the last 40 years to see that there is a little technology. Technology can help us. It's called family planning. Is there really such rocket science? In other words, there is an intervention which can be applied, in the words of Jonathan Porritt, wisely, compassionately, and democratically, and has been in countries as diverse as Sri Lanka, Costa Rica, Cuba, Iran, and elsewhere, and has brought family sizes down with no coercion, in the same time as China did it, about 8 years, with just the making choices available to women. Again, I hope we'll have time to come back to that. Mahatma Gandhi said, the world's enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. All of us would agree that number 2 remains completely true. But I believe that number 1 may no longer be true, because we probably now have too many everyones if we want everyone on earth to live a modest British lifestyle. Humans currently utilize 130% of the world's total biological capacity. And by 2050, which folks is 42 years' time, a lifetime of lots of you here, okay, I'll be in my 110 or something, but there will be the need for another planet, even if we live with the dire poverty we've got now. And if we were to get rid of poverty, we'd probably need 4 planets by then. Are we going to do it that way? Now, I'm sorry, folks, this is where the bad news comes in. Ain't going to be like that. I fear it'll be by there being half as many of us. There's a little picture on the top right to show us again how small our world is and what a stress we're putting on our beautiful biosphere. So here, if there wasn't any other lecture, any other slide in my lecture, this to me is the crunch. Either we go down what some people in the world reject as artificial, that route of family planning with a pill and other methods, and many Christians still feel like that a bit. Or we allow nature to do what's coming up on the right there, what already has happened in places like Rwanda, and is certainly happening now in Zimbabwe, and just everywhere. We're going to see more and more of that. Basically, Al Gore's film, I've been doing it wherever I lecture in the last month, I've been asking people to raise their hands if they've actually seen Al Gore's film. Ah, that's amazing, well done. The last place I lectured, about 5 hands went up. They'd heard the title. That was out of 180 people in Cardiff. Isn't this the most inconvenient truth? Our planet is finite. Unending growth is just not an option. As Crispin Takela said, unremitting growth is the doctrine of the cancer cell. And in many ways we have to think of ourselves as a bit of a cancer on this beautiful planet. We have to think of ourselves as being on the Titanic. And I'm sure we'll be using that analogy during the rest of this couple of days. The Titanic rushing headlong to a disaster. That's trying to be a little bit of light relief because it's getting a bit heavy, isn't it? Of course, poor old penguins aren't going to be able to mess around in the snow and ice quite as much as they used to. Two sides of the same coin, folks. I will not please be misquoted as saying I think that family planning is a sort of panacea, it's the answer to everything. It is not. Of course it's not. Why can't people say it? If you say family planning is important as well, then what seems to be received by people all the time is family planning instead. You're going to give them condoms, you're going to give them sex education, you're not going to give them healthcare and all the other requirements. Why is it possible for a humane person to be concerned about both in equal measure? And let's remember, folks, another slogan, please write this down. The greenest energy is the energy you don't use. And that I would interpret in two ways. The obvious way, to insulate our homes, nice to see we've got to double our thermal efficiency in buildings really quickly. That is a big thing to do on the right-hand side of the coin. But the greenest energy is the energy you don't use, and one way of not using it, folks, is if you have one less child. Because in fact, although we tend to think of the problem as being all overseas, and I've already been hinting at it in a way in that respect, every unplanned pregnancy in this country is equivalent to 160 in Ethiopia because of our fossil fuel consumption. And if we, how many of us have got children? Come on, hands up. If we can persuade our children, they haven't finished childbearing yet, properly educate them to have either two children as a plus or minus one, two children plus or minus one as the obvious number for replacement on this planet, or to have one child less, if they really must have four, to have three, if they really must have five, to have four. Unless we can get people in this part of the world to have one child less at least, what a wonderful thing that will be if we can. Because it's equivalent to 3 million miles, we've calculated, of not driving in a Toyota Prius in that person's lifetime, in terms of carbon dioxide production. It's 624 flights to North America return, not happening because of that person not being there. So family planning is hugely important, both in the rich and the poor countries. And yet, most accidents, or very many accidents in the world, are caused by humans, and very many humans are still caused by accidents. Which in a sense gives us an opportunity, because we can use family planning to help there to be less accidental humans around the world, and we need to do that mighty fast. Population birth planning, I wish I had time, I'm not going to do it, but just look at this list. You will not believe how many things, only 5 minutes left, that's impossible. To overuse fossil fuels, more to die in each climatic or natural disaster, human rights, violence, genocide, terrorism, mass migration, it's been mentioned already, diseases, wonderful, you've got a lot of culture flesh. If you were a self-respecting virus, wouldn't you use the most omnipresent culture medium there is, human flesh? Maternal mortality, did you know that that it is the equivalent of a jumbo jet of women crashing fully pregnant every 6 hours? That's the number of dying. 1 a minute, night and day. And 2/3 of them are dying of pregnancies they wanted, but 1/3 are dying of a pregnancy they didn't want in the first place. Bad enough to die of a pregnancy you wanted, but to be killed by a pregnancy you would have avoided if we had helped you to use the family planning you want to use, is doubly miserable. Infant mortality, it's been shown that if you stretch the interval between pregnancies, the babies live better, so you can reduce infant mortality. Poverty per head. I mean, in Rwanda, the GDP of the country went up very well between 1940s and 1994, but the per person GDP plummeted. Shortage of water and food, another slogan. Why don't we see that shortages of resources are caused by longages of people wanting the resource? These are such obvious things, it's not rocket science. By the way, that slide I showed you just now, an absent person has no footprint. That came from Chris Rapley, who many of you may know was professor of the British Antarctic Survey till recently, just up the road, Madame Road here, and he said, it's not rocket science, that slide. And I can say that with strength because I used to be a rocket scientist. And of course, no chance to go into this either, but conservation of biodiversity and habitats of wildlife. Human beings are behind the problem, and the less of us, the better now, as we look to this century. Family planning could bring more benefits to more people at less cost than any other single technology now available to the human race. So said James Grant, way back in '92. And it was UNICEF saying it. So how are we going to do it, folks? Are we going to do it by banning sex? No, isn't that a lovely picture from the Kruger National Park? Best oral contraceptive saying no is never going to be popular. So we've got this technology. It is a form of technology that we should be rejoicing in. Faraday, I think it was, who said he was a scientist thinking God's thoughts after him. I think that the fact that in the late 20th century we have developed effective reversible family planning is exactly in that ballpark, and that Christians, far from being opposed to family planning, should be saying, praise the Lord for this technology which has arrived in the nick of time. And should we not, if you wonder why the picture of that woman on the top right-hand corner, should we not see these, the pill, the injection, and the IUD, as much icons of the environment as her bicycle? In fact, in '94, I buried a project of mine burying time capsules in Kew Gardens and in other parts of the world, in the Seychelles, Australia, and elsewhere, and we put in environmentally relevant objects and said we were apologising to the future about the way we're going to mess it up for them, and into the time capsule we put a packet of pills for that very reason, as well as obviously a bicycle pump and other things were good. No time to go into this in terms of solutions, but I will be talking after supper for some of you tonight on the demographic transition. Many people think that's the only way forward. The only way we're going to solve this problem is to wait for the costs of a child to go up and the benefits of a child to go down by development. And that, unfortunately, is not going to happen quickly enough in many countries. There's a damaging myth out there I've already alluded to, that any quantitative concern about human numbers on a finite planet is intrinsically coercive. I refute that. Intrinsically, it is not. It is intrinsically exclusive of other vital concerns. I refute that too. Intrinsically, it is not. It is perfectly possible to be equally worried about poverty and ordinary consumption, and I'm as much a campaigner about those, I would say, as on the other issues. And then it's sort of anti-human too. You're stopping these wonderful babies coming. So myth. What I'm for is everything you see on this slide. What changes birth rates is all those things, holistically provided to the developing world. But it must include the top left. There's a slogan that goes with that, which is take care of the people, and the population will take care of itself. And I am quite happy to accept that slogan, so long as we properly take care of the women. And you can't properly take care of women unless you offer them the choice of contraception, which men withhold all over the world. Their husbands do, and the people who run the world do. Now you may say, isn't it true in rural poverty, every mouth has two hands, and that high infant mortality needs to be compensated for? Of course there's truth in those two things. But for starters, no woman wants the biological maximum number of children at time present. I know this. That's 10 children. They don't even want 10 in Niger or Rwanda. And secondly, so many conceptions are unplanned, as I said before. There is a widespread unmet need for family planning. This is the percentage of married women who want to have no more than 2 children in all those countries on really good recent survey data. Yet, the actual TFR, and in shorthand TFR is average family size, is actually between 3 and 6. We're missing a trick, folks. At least we could start by pushing at the open door and meeting the objectively present unmet need. So what works? I'm going to be finishing in about 2 minutes, Prof. Make as wide a range of fertility regulation options available as possible. Use as wide a range of distribution channels as resources permit, and remove barriers to women. And again, this evening I'm going to list some of the amazing barriers there are. But of course, one of the strongest ones is just availability. In Rwanda, a woman who wants to have a smaller family, you see, I didn't say birth control. No, you don't use the word control. But a woman who wants to have a smaller family would have to use a condom, and how do you persuade your man to do that? Or be sterilized, virtually, in practice, instead of the wonderful choice we have. Those countries I mentioned before, South Korea, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Colombia, others. If you make contraceptives available and accessible, remove the barriers to women, and correct much misinformation. In Rwanda, when I was last there, I was told, if you go on the pill, it'll make you sterile for life. Now, that is believed. People who ought to know better are spreading such disinformation, and as a consequence, of course, people don't use family planning. They believe it's safer to let nature take its course than to use a contraceptive, when, of course, with maternal mortality running as high as it is, it's absolutely not the case. We have a lovely planet, folks. I thought it's time we saw some pictures of the beautiful world we've inherited. Have you heard that saying? We've not inherited the world from our grandparents, we've borrowed it from our grandchildren. There's another thing to write down. Attributed to the Kashmiris. And we're not just thinking enough about our grandchildren, are we? That's a picture from northern Rwanda of the Virunga volcanoes. I've climbed one on the right. Wild species now comprise only 3% of vertebrate flesh on planet Earth. That's because the remaining 97% is human flesh, or the cows, the pigs, the sheep, the goats that we farm. Isn't that a disastrous thought? Only 3% left for all the elephants, all the tigers, all the big animals as well as small on land. There's data for that. I'll give you the reference if you want it. I've been in the business, folks, a long time. I was an undergraduate medical student at St John's, Cambridge, which is on the corner from here, and in 1959, believe it or not, I attended a lecture, still not sure what branch of medicine to go into. And I had a lecture a bit like the last 20 minutes you've been listening to me. And I said, obviously, as a doctor, I can't get into energy and things, but I can do something, and therefore I'm going to specialize in family planning. And I wrote this article 3 years later, standing room only, in the St Bartholomew's Medical Journal. So I'm not a beginner in this business. Many of us in this room, that may be true of too. So as I conclude, on the left, wildlife, on the right, poor people. And I want to commend to you, and you don't need to be a Christian to agree, that Jesus' 2 great rules, great commandments, were amazing. He said you should love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And I don't believe you can be properly loving God if you don't love what He's made on the left. And one way of loving what He's made, the other creatures we share this world with, is to make sure there are not altogether so many of one species, namely us, that we seriously prejudice their future. And on the right, it's the neighbor. You should love your neighbor as yourself. And we need to love our neighbor overseas, and Christians and other religious people are better than average in that respect. But we also ought to love our future neighbor. And you can't be saying to yourself, I'm really, in 2008, fulfilling commandment number 2, if you completely forget future neighbor. And these 2 things, in fact, were the reason, after a long time away from Christianity, I came back. Because, harking back to what St John Hartman was saying, how could you see any future for this planet unless we get more widespread acceptance of those 2 commandments, interpreted as I just did? Every child, a wanted child. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, John. We have some time for some questions. Perhaps the lights could go on somewhere. I don't know how that happens. I'll do it when I come back. We'll see where we are, and we'll have a few in this room, and then take on to the other rooms before. Yes, first question, I think.
Hello. The fundamental question for me is, how can we convince the Catholic Church and many members of the religious right that contraception is so much better than abortion, and so much better than thousands of unwanted children?
Wonderful. I didn't plan that question. But it's absolutely the case. I mean, isn't it bizarre? It beggars belief that there should be people out there who say what I've just fairly cogently argued is something really good and morally right, they actually argue it's really bad and morally bad. How could they? What could an anti-life? What is more pro-life than stopping 1/3 of 550,000 women being killed by pregnancy they didn't want? You can't die of a pregnancy you don't have, folks. If you don't have it, because you've got the choice not to have it. And abortions, 50 million a year in the world. And who causes more abortions than anybody else, I fear? A man in the middle of Italy, by his ban on contraception. Sorry for the Catholics here, but I mean, if you ban contraception, you are going to cause a lot of abortions. They're always going to happen, I'm afraid, in the real world we've got. And I'm not going to get diverted into the whole issue of the ethics of it, but just being a doctor, abortions are happening, and it is much better, as a doctor or as a human being, surely, to avoid them happening in the first place by family planning.
Question here, yes.
I don't know, where's the... I can call up Hillary.
Yes, Henry, people running around, yes. There's a question right here. In this row here, Bob. Yes, right here.
Oh, I know this.
Yep.
Thank you very much, John, for such an interesting talk and very informative too. My name's Marilla Carter, and my husband Richard Carter, and Richard's a water engineer, as I have been in my past. We had the pleasure of meeting your parents in Kigali in 1983, and we did a documentary. That's just by way of introduction, and I think your sister Margaret as well. Richard and I are in danger of being rather smug because of our fertility, or rather infertility problem. We never produced children of our own, but a few years after returning from Rwanda, we adopted some children. The younger of these children, Timothy, has very severe ADHD, and I've done a great deal of research into this in order to meet his needs during his rather difficult lifetime, particularly his educational needs. Now, it turns out, according to Professor Russell Barkley, who is the leading physician in ADHD, an American, that the statistics for births to under 20-year-olds, at least in the USA, are such that 41 times more babies are conceived by young people with ADHD or ADD, the non-hyperactive type, than by a control group of under 20-year-olds in the USA.
If they're happening unplanned, is that the point?
I think I don't know whether it's totally unplanned, or whether these are...
Can you get to the question you're really asking then?
The question is your organisation taking into account the fact that many unplanned pregnancies are coming about by people who are not necessarily uninformed, but have an inherent neurological problem with self-organisation and impulsivity.
Absolutely. I can answer that very quickly. That's why one of the things that when I was lecturing in Cardiff last week, and I'm off to Dover to lecture to 400 doctors and nurses on Thursday, around the country as I go, what I'm arguing for is what's called the LARCs, the long-acting reversible contraceptives. Because if your contraceptive is something you can have on board, an example is the injection, Depo-Provera, or the implant, then that problem of planning is not nearly such a big one, because of course it's there long term. Yes. And I think a massive world move to the LARCs and away from the pill would be good.
Yes.
Okay, we're going to have one more question in here, and then we're going to go to the other room. And
sorry, you need to speak to us.
Be close to him, or they might not hear.
Sorry,
we're going to have one more question from this room, and then we're going to go to the other room. So there was a question right at the back, second row from the back there. Little Hillary, thank you very much.
Hello, I spoke earlier. My name is Sandra White, and I'm an eco-psychologist. And I'm very preoccupied with the kinds of messages that we give out that are attractive. And I just wanted to propose to you that when you talk about unremitting growth is the doctrine of the cancer cell,
very negative image.
I don't find that an attractive image.
No, I
but
agree with you.
a colleague in my movement said to me only last week that we are behaving in exactly the way that we should expect any species that doesn't have a predator to act. And I find that a much more helpful image, because then what that...
So what's the slogan become?
I haven't worked that
Shall
out
we
yet.
find a predator?
No. But what I think that does for us then is call out the best motivations of humanity
I can
and
see
our
that.
talents that are about rationality
I accept
and
that.
imagination.
I accept that. In fact, one of the great problems, I was talking in a group here, which I felt we could just call spades spades. But in the world out there, you can't call spades spades, so you just call doom and gloom. And we all become ostriches, don't we? I mean, people pass through a phase of denial and the cornucopians and everything we were talking about before coffee. And then they suddenly accept this as scientific fact. And they either go totally into the denial mode and say, sorry, I'm still not going to believe it, or they shoot themselves. I mean, they feel there's no other choice. Or thirdly, they become, I suppose, eat, drink, and be merry and stuff the people who are coming after us. Those are the three ways you go if you overdo it, because if you overcook it, because people are too gloomy. So one of the sort of projects we could all have for the rest of today is to devise lots and lots of positive ways of saying the same thing.
We've got time just for one last question, and it's going to be from the other room. I'm afraid that's so. Jonathan Moo, are you there?
Yes, we have a question. Hello. You advocated a move to towns and cities as a way of bringing population down. I'm just wondering, is there any evidence that for rural farmers, where they feel more secure in their conditions, they have less children, and those who feel more insecure breed children as a way of countering that?
Well, I think you must be referring to that slide, the comprehensive slide of what changes birth rates when you make that point. And I didn't have time, because there's only a limit to what you can say in 30 minutes, to point out that some of those things are not necessarily good, and some are things we should really be encouraging. But they're just shown to do that. In the sense of everybody moving to cities, there are positives and negatives, like most things. At least they damage less countryside because they use less space, they're less concrete. You know, spread the concrete centrally, with going upwards rather than outwards, etc. And it certainly is an observed fact that in a city, your need for two hands is less. The Mao slogan, every mouth has got two hands. Your need for two hands is less, and your cost, particularly of education of your children and healthcare and so on, go up. So people do choose to have fewer children. Obviously, the trouble is that cities at the moment can't possibly cope. I mean, how could you produce a complete city with all necessary infrastructure and all the sewage disposal, going back to the water thing we were talking about before, in every week, a mega city, 1.5 million people. So I would ask you not to go away with the message that I'm in favour of movement to cities and everybody live in slums. But to go to the other half of your question, if we make things right for people wherever they live, cities or countryside, and give women choices, even in the countryside, they will have fewer children. It is, as I said before, no woman I've ever spoken to wants 10, really. They have them because they don't have choice in the matter up to that, but they don't want that. So we can start by helping to have fewer than that. And then after that, all these surveys, which include rural women, show that women want smaller families, a lot smaller than even that, coming right down eventually to replacement. And the countries where there is replacement fertility, aside from China, are not countries where you could say there's coercion about it. At the moment, we are coercing a whole lot of women, millions of women, probably 190 million of them, to have the babies they don't want, because by default, we're not giving them family planning, which we take for granted as a normal thing that women can do. And I call that coercion. So if anybody accuses me of coercion, I say, how about those coercive pregnancies and the abortions that are being coerced on people around the world?
Well, thank you very much indeed, John. I'm afraid we've got to move on now for the time, so thank you very much indeed for being here.